Hello and welcome to the Joe's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical every single day. It's episode 13, unlucky for some, but not for us today, as I sit down with the wonderful art and fashion historian Robert McCaffrey and talk about one of Alexander McQueen's most iconic collections and catwalk presentations. And we are of course talking about collection number 13. And we're also very chuffed with how nicely both numbers have aligned with each other today. I came across Robert online and he was nice enough to send me a link to an incredible paper that he has recently written, which can be found on the Fashion Studies Journal, and it's entitled Alexander McQueen The Sublime and the Melancholy. And the paper is all about two particular catwalk presentations, and when I read it I was like, I absolutely have to speak to you about this. And then when we kind of started breaking it down, we realised the topic was so huge, it's probably best if we split it into two different episodes, which is what we've done. Today we're bringing you Alexander McQueen and the Sublime, and we're going to be looking at how McQueen as a designer and really, in my opinion, performance artist presented his collections and what he tried to make his collectors and viewers to this presentation feel, and how he was inspired by different movements within art history, design, and certain artworks that stayed with him and really resonated and inspired him in his creations. It's a really interesting conversation, and I have to thank Robert. He's completely opened my eyes to the wonderful world of Alexander McQueen, who is somebody of course I knew about. It wasn't until reading Robert's paper that I sat down and watched one of McQueen's catwalk shows for the first time, and it took me down this unbelievable rabbit hole of presentations and catwalk shows, and before I knew it, nearly 2 hours had gone by, and it was just amazing, and I regret nothing. So sit back and relax as Robert and I discuss Alexander McQueen and the Sublime. So we're going to talk today about Alexander McQueen and the Sublime, but I have to ask, where was the first time you came across Alexander McQueen? Can you remember?
Well, I think it's not going to be the most exciting story. It is just on YouTube. I was obviously aware of Alexander McQueen. I'd probably seen pictures in magazines and things like that. But as an actual catwalk or the presentations that he did, I would have to say I was definitely not aware until one day on YouTube, I happened to see the finale of number 13, the show we're going to talk about, with Shalom Harlow and the two robotic arms. And it stopped me in my tracks and had a massive influence and led to me essentially watching every video, every catwalk of McQueen's and pretty much still do it now for pleasure. Is that sad?
No, not at all, because it's exactly what your paper made me do when I read through it. I was like, why have I got to 30 years old and this has never crossed my mind? Because very much like you, I had heard of him, but I'd never really sort of gone down the Alexander McQueen rabbit hole. And what a character, what a performer, what a designer, just amazing.
No, absolutely. I mean, looking into his personal story is obviously part and parcel of researching something like this. And there's some amazing quotes from him. His life story is very interesting. And he, sometimes we think about fashion as something removed from art, and that maybe intellectuals come along and then they superimpose this intellectual idea over the fashion. And it was never intended by the designer, but that was not the case with McQueen. He was really conceptual in his thinking. He would often start by thinking about his show before he designs the garments for it. So McQueen was, by any other name, he was a performance artist. And it just happened to be the medium was the fashion industry. It was almost like that was a happy accident.
Could not agree more with you, Robert. I just think and I would seriously encourage everyone listening to, once you've listened to this, to go away and watch some of his catwalk shows. We'll of course link the show that we're going to talk about in the show notes below, as well as all the images that we reference, and they'll be available to view on my website and on my Instagram page. But he really is a performance artist, and the whole thing that we're going to talk about today is the idea of Alexander McQueen and the Sublime. And I think my question to you is, the Sublime seems to be this huge big word in art historical terms that can mean so much. And really, how can we begin to break that down? So what
Wow,
is the
yeah.
sublime?
Well, where did I encounter the sublime first of all? Probably the same place as most people. When someone's talking about amazing food, this soup is sublime, this coffee is sublime. I think in modern parlance, the word sublime has got a really, it's lost its teeth. It's a really muted term. But you can take the philosophy and you can take the meaning of the sublime and you can go all the way back to the first century AD. And it was originally a Greek work of literary criticism that was concerned with the sublime in rhetoric, in writing, how good writing has the power to move someone, really engage and move the reader or listener if the words were being spoken. So that's the first kind of reference, is the reference we have to the sublime as a philosophy. But then if we fly forward to the 18th century, author and philosopher Edmund Burke explored the sublime, but he switched to aesthetics. And he declared that the beautiful is that which is well formed and pleasing to the eye, whereas the sublime is something that promotes, and I quote, feelings of awe mixed with pleasure. And that's the key difference here. Beautiful is beautiful. We understand what beautiful is, but the sublime is something else. And to break down his quote, feelings of awe mixed with pleasure, I would say awe, that's a feeling, and pleasure, that's a feeling. So if it's this mixture, then the sublime exists in the space between the two feelings. And that's what makes it really interesting. There's a tension there. It's neither one nor the other. And I want to clarify what I mean by awe. This isn't awe like, oh, that's amazing. This is awe like it's terrifying. It's something kind of fiery. The most common example is the painting Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. And this is one way we think about the sublime. There are others, but essentially it's the idea of something that's so vast, probably in nature, like a giant storm cloud, a thunderstorm, or a volcano erupting, that in its presence we become very mortal. We realize our life is finite and we are maybe terrified. The sublime brings in this other element of safety and security, where you're encountering this awesome thing that has the power to destroy you, but you are safe. It's essentially the roller coaster with the seatbelt. You know you're in danger, but you know you're safe. And it's that feeling of exhilaration, danger, but also security, that is what really the sublime is at its core when we talk about the philosophy of the sublime. So how does the sublime get into art? No one has a roller coaster experience in an art gallery, or do they?
Well, that's the thing. And I think, like you said, Caspar David Friedrich's painting is kind of really the perfect example of that. It's when you encounter a piece that completely moves you. And just for anyone, this is such an iconic piece within the history of art. And it's probably something that you don't know it to name, but you will definitely know it to see it. So just to describe it for the listeners, it's this gentleman that's standing almost on a rocky cliff edge, and he looks out onto this vast landscape of fog, and there's this enormous sky, and the figure is facing, his back is to the viewer, and he's just kind of like looking out onto this expansive, I don't know, future nothingness, complete mystery of what's before him. And
Well,
this really sort of sums up.
I was just going to say that Caspar David Friedrich was essentially a landscape painter, which sounds like the dull end of the art history spectrum, except the way he painted was he really caught this sense of immense, vast skies that were quite overwhelming. And I almost think Wander Above a Sea of Fog is a poor example of the kind of painting he did. But by inserting the man on top of the rocks over that kind of foggy landscape where everything is a bit of a mystery because you don't know what's on the other side of that fog, he kind of ticks all the boxes that make the sublime. So it technically is the sublime, but I have to say, I hate to be critical, but I do not think it necessarily warrants the sense of wow that some of his other paintings do, but it definitely ticks the boxes.
Well, that's it. And it's become this thing. It was actually largely ignored until about the 1950s. So it was painted in 1880, and it wasn't until an art historian started writing about it in 1950. And it's in the Kunsthalle in Hamburg. And it's now become this like go-to painting that people must see. But yeah, you're right. I must be honest, Caspar David Friedrich I don't know a horrendous amount about him, but he does fall into the sort of romantic
Definitely.
of painters. Um,
He's probably more known for romantic than the idea of tackling the sublime, but
yeah,
they're both philosophies essentially, aren't they? And I think that in the 19th century there's a lot of crossover between the sublime and romantic, and it's all about feelings, and we can picture the Victorians now. Everything's about, how do you feel about this, are you being moved by that, and that's what was concerning to them, that was what was of interest to them.
and like you said, he ties in very nicely to the whole idea of romanticism and the idea of the sublime, which of course was a movement of romantic thinkers, of painters and writers, philosophers, but a direct influence on the work and influence of Alexander McQueen when he was at university.
Well, you see, that's an interesting point. Was it?
Oh,
There's no evidence to suggest that this particular painting, Wander Above a Sea of Fog, was even seen by McQueen, or whether McQueen was thinking about the sublime. In fact, the first time I encountered the word sublime in relation to McQueen was Andrew Bolton, the V&A curator that did the
mhm.
Savage Beauty show, when he essentially built the exhibition around the idea of the sublime as an object. So he was looking at the fashion garments and saying that they were sublime. But if you really read carefully what he said, you feel like it's sublime light. He's not really, a garment struggles to be sublime because it's not going to move you the same way as maybe a thunderstorm painting might. So I became interested in the idea of, well, if there is sublime in McQueen, and I don't agree with Andrew Bolton that it's in the garment, where is it? And I believed it was in the performance, it is in the action. And that kind of takes us to a new territory of the performative sublime, which is far less written about. But, like all of these things, the sublime starts in literary criticism, it moves into aesthetics. Why the hell can't it move into the performative sphere? It makes sense.
Well, that's it. And if anybody has seen a McQueen catwalk show, you are complete awestruck that it is incredible, and it is a performance in itself. Some of his things that he managed to do, and it was the thing that people craved at Fashion Week when McQueen was alive and doing his shows. He was known for these very performance based displays.
Theatrical.
Yes, theatrical.
I mean,
Mm.
his inspirations were so varied. One thing that kind of tickles me is there's one particular show that was inspired by the chess scene in one of the Harry Potter films. That's quite mundane and almost daft. And then there are shows inspired by the Highland clearances, which is so intellectual and historical. So there's definitely a lot of different inspirations going on. As much as it's hard to say he was inspired by the sublime, he certainly was inspired by pieces that are in dialogue with the sublime. And one of those pieces, which I think we're going to talk about, is Rebecca Horn's High Moon, the kinetic sculpture that she made.
And I must say, I had never come across this sculpture before until I read your paper, and I think it's something that will haunt my dreams forever, if I'm perfectly honest with you. It's such an uneasy piece to sort of look at, but then when you read into it, it's so interesting. And I think
Oh yeah,
Rebecca, this German performance conceptual artist, she's all about the idea of body and how you can transform it and ways of pushing the limits of that. And this piece is so incredible. Do you want to describe what it looks like?
absolutely. I mean, you need to see it, and you need to ideally see it in action, but hopefully this description will suffice. But essentially, hanging from the ceiling of the gallery are two Winchester rifles, which are themselves connected via plastic tubing to two big vats of red liquid. And the red liquid is feeding from these vats that are funnel-like in shape and clear glass. The red liquid feeds through these tubes to the guns, and the guns intermittently squirt the red liquid at each other. So far, it sounds so silly, but it happens at irregular intervals. And finally, there is a trough along the floor of the gallery that is catching some, but certainly not all, of these sprays that are going about the place. It's sexual and violent. That's what is interesting about this particular sculpture. And it walks this line between tension and release. It's kind of creepy and weird. And there's this organic element to the red liquid and this inorganic element to the guns that I think kind of gives us that sense of where does the human end and where does the gun begin in violence. And obviously the sexual connotations are unmissable.
Yeah.
It's very different from her other works as well, which usually are about extending the human body or changing the body in some way. It's like here she has, I mean, she did this with a lot of her kinetic sculptures, but she has totally removed the person from its physical. Yeah. But it's definitely, you get a sense of, and I think this is the other interesting idea that relates High Moon to the finale of McQueen's number 13 show, is that there's something mechanized, something unnatural, but it's given human qualities. And in this case, it's the kind of the squirting of the liquid at intervals, which are, it's not that tick, 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 tick of a machine. It's broken intervals that feel kind of organic or natural, although inexplicable.
Yeah, that's it. And I love this idea of looking at it in this that almost that the human and the machine have become one. And I don't know, like we've it's kind of, you know, the human has dissolved, and you know, maybe it's a conversation about how humans are being replaced by machines, or our dependency on machines, and what that can mean, and violence and all those sorts of connotations of that. It really is quite an awe-inspiring piece, really, to think about it and really sort of delve into it. I don't know, have you ever seen it in real life?
No, I went to an exhibition of her work, and this was one of the pieces that wasn't there. Typical. Interestingly, though, the way you described it is, it's quite clear that, because Alexander McQueen did see this piece, and it's on record that it inspired the finale of number 13. But that whole presentation, that whole catwalk show, was about the arts and crafts movement, and it was about this tension between the machine made and the handmade. And you intuited that when talking about High Moon. So you could see how Alexander McQueen intuited the same thing and kind of went down the same path when creating his collection. But it's so evident with the finale of number 13, which, I mean, if you're happy to, shall I go ahead and describe that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it would be really great if you could set the scene, actually, of what this show was about. And because, like you said, it was, so the catwalk show was all about the arts and crafts movement, which people listening don't know what that is. It was a movement founded by William Morris, and it was all about the truth to materials, and it was about this group of artists that were rebelling against the industrial revolution almost, and celebrating the man-made, and it was all about truth to materials. And McQueen has sort of carried that through with this incredible show. So do you want to describe the
Definitely.
Sort of
I mean, it is the show that turned me on to McQueen in the first place. It's the show that introduced me to the Sublime. So excuse me if I sound a little bit passionate here.
Go for it.
The number 13 was a show that took place in 1998, and it took place at the Gatlith Warehouse in Victoria, an old bus station. The 90s fashion shows, Britpop, it was all about kind of using these kind of spaces and trying to create an exciting vibe. Bear in mind, Alexander McQueen was established at this point. He's not some graduate who's trying to find his feet. He is a world famous brand at this point. The whole show just takes place already in an unusual kind of format, because it's just a square, and it has two robotic arms just asleep in the middle of this square space. The audience is on three sides, and the models just come walking in. It starts actually with Paralympian model Amy Mullins, who has no lower legs. She was born with no shin bones, and she had her legs amputated from the knee down at the age of 1, I think. But she comes walking out into kind of a dim light, so the audience can't quite see her properly, and then the lights come up. And what everyone's seen is this woman with these amazing leather boots. It turns out that they're not amazing leather boots at all. They are, in fact, hand-carved wooden prosthetics. And for those that didn't know who Amy Mullins was, they immediately went out to try and buy this amazing pair of leather shoes that don't exist, because they weren't leather shoes, they were an extension. But it was a man-made extension of the female body. So we're setting the tone straight away at the beginning of the show. We're already in dialogue between, the human made, handmade, but how it infuses itself with the body. And that's interesting straight away, but it's going to go so far from this point. The rest of the show is beautiful handcrafted pieces, definitely inspired by the arts and craft movement. Erin O'Connor wears this fantastic fan piece that resembles stained glass windows, which is on so many levels engaging the arts and crafts movement. And the whole thing is bizarrely contrasted with kind of hard dance core music, which immediately sounds very strange, but it comes to make sense at the end, where the stage goes lovely and quiet, all the models leave, and then my favourite model of all time, probably just because of this particular moment, Shalom Harlow, a former ballerina, she walks out and stands between the two robotic arms, and she's wearing this simple white puff dress that's belted just at the chest point. Interesting little side note. Apparently they'd practiced, they thought about this, they'd done everything, and they'd forgot until the night before to actually conceive of a garment for this finale. So they quickly had to grab fabric that they had, synthetic tulle, and quickly run this garment together literally the night before. It was a total afterthought. But yeah, she's now standing there in this very simple, very pretty white dress, and she starts to rotate because she's standing on a little rotating platform, just turning around. And she is like the when you open your jewelry box and you've got that little, you're going to have to help me here. What's that called?
Little ballerina that rotates. That's such a fantastic way to describe that. Exactly. When you open your jewelry box and you have your little sort of ballerina that moves around and dances.
Absolutely. And that's what Shalom Harlow is looking like at this point in the presentation. And the music has now changed completely. We're listening to Camille Saint-Saëns' The Swan, which is a lovely classical piece of music, very delicate. And at this same moment, while she's rotating, the two robotic arms on either side of her seem to wake up, and they're very carefully looking at her. They seem to be curious about her. And we as watchers, I mean, this is where we start to get the idea of the sublime, particularly the performative contemporary sublime. These two robotic arms, which have been borrowed from a car manufacturing plant in Italy, we anthropomorphize them. We instantly, no one watching this would disagree. You find you're going, oh, look, they're curious. They seem to be engaging. They're looking. And that's what's happening. They're curious about this woman turning around between them. And then eventually, like a coiled snake, they pull back, and then they lash forward and start spraying her with paint. One of the robots is spraying jet black paint, and the other one is spraying acid yellow. And between them, this dress is now becoming covered in these gorgeous patterns. But there's something distinctly violent about the way these two robotic arms are doing what they're doing. And of course, Shalom Harlow, a trained ballet dancer, is acting out this. She is. Some writers at the time called it sexual, and you can see there's an element of how maybe she's being, for want of a better word, like she's being terrorized, sexually terrorized.
Yeah.
But that was definitely not the correct reading at all, because once it was clear that the inspiration came from Rebecca Horn, it was more about the anthropomorphization, if that's a word, of these robots. And of course, they are lashing out, and she is succumbing to their power. And this is where we get back to the idea of the arts and crafts, which I think is interesting, because at first we kind of had this fusion of the handmaid and the woman and how fantastic that was. But we find the whole exhibition is bookended, and it ends with the power of the machine to overcome and defeat the person. And at the end of the spray painting, Shalom Harlow staggers forward, her spine is arched, and she's given up. She's defeated. And that's the visual metaphor that we're kind of left with. It's the only presentation, apparently, that actually made McQueen himself cry, because it went exactly the way he wanted it to, and it had the impact that he wanted it to have.
I'll put a link in the show notes to a YouTube video of this show. It's well, completely. Here you go. I'm speechless. I can't
And
even.
I need to take a breath.
Well,
So
that's it. And we've seen this. And again, it's just it's so powerful. And it's the moment, like you said, and for me as well, where I was like, how has this completely bypassed me? It's just
absolutely. Uh,
incredible.
but I think it does bypass people because it seems to live in the realm of fashion.
Mm.
And the 2015 exhibition of Savage Beauty, that obviously was in New York and here in London as well, helped move McQueen from the realm of fashion into maybe the consciousness of art. And so I think it's changing, but that wasn't the presentations themselves. And I think what interests me is if you look at one presentation, look at two presentations, look at more, look at Voss from 2001,
Mm.
you start to realize that the clothes were secondary. This was performance art. This is performance art that is up there with Abramovic. You know, this is someone who's really making a statement through performance that is in dialogue with other art forms, with culture, with history. So I think when people don't know about this, that's fine. You know, it seems to belong to the realm of fashion, but you know, I write a paper like this with the goal of hopefully changing people's minds and really relocating it to the sphere of art.
Well, absolutely, and it should be, and just like you said there, it's kept in this sort of realm. Again, fashion, very much like art, kind of suffers from this gatekeeping aspect that it's only for people with money or if you're cut from a certain cloth. And it's not that at all. Like, fashion in itself, whether you buy from H&M or Primark or, top designers, it's your way of performing art every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's your own performance art. And I think for McQueen, he is just such an interesting character and hands down an artist. He
Mm-hmm.
incredible, so powerful, so moving. And I just can't thank you enough for writing this paper. And yeah, I just couldn't wait to talk to you about this. It's just so interesting.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, it was an absolute pleasure. Like the Fashion Studies Journal, where the paper is published, that they were really supportive as well. They were very interested in it. They actually modified my original pitch, so it was the Sublime and the Melancholy in
Mm.
McQueen. So there's a whole other area there devoted to the Melancholy, but unpacking that. That's a whole podcast in its own right, and a whole other philosophical field that we can't get into. But it does go to show, I mean, maybe McQueen is better recognised for his melancholy because there's a sadness to a lot of his shows. La Dame Bleue, when his mentor Isabella Blow died, the whole show is very toned with this melancholy. Then, of course, there's The Widows of Culloden, which I know you liked,
Oh gosh.
which that finishes with a Pepper's Ghost hologram, some people call it, is of Kate Moss floating apparition like inside a pyramid. And that, you know, it really does evoke that feeling of melancholy, which, like the Sublime, is one of these philosophical ideas that sits between two clear, distinct feelings. So it's got that interesting tension again, whereas the Sublime sits between maybe horror and pleasure,
Mm.
and the Melancholy sits between happiness and sadness. It's that reverie. You're looking back on memories of your childhood, and you're sad, but they make you smile at the same time. And so I think these two philosophical ideas, the Sublime and the Melancholy, are really interesting when found in art. Way more interesting for me when found in fashion that is art.
Melancholy as well for Alexander McQueen. It really, like the Sublime and the Melancholy, they do go hand in hand with his presentations and his collections. But, McQueen himself, famously took his own life very sadly in 2010. He was very troubled, and it was well known that he was. But also in the realm of fashion, there is a lot of issues and, of course, art that need to be addressed. A lot of sort of mental health issues, and I think McQueen is just really he has particularly the windows at Culloden for me really embodies that idea of longing and sadness and oh gosh I just think it's
It's
fabulous.
it's wearing your heart on your sleeve, isn't it? It's like with different artists, sometimes the best artists are the ones who put it all out there for
Mm,
everyone to see.
overshare.
Tracy Emin, for
Oh
example,
yeah.
and you get a real sense of their feeling in the artwork. And I think McQueen was a very, very good example of that. But there was so many extra layers. I mean, one of the things that I definitely wanted to talk about, which I think I should bring up now, is this mind-boggling idea of why the robotic arms or the guns in Rebecca Horn's High Moon, why they make us uncomfortable. What is he tapping into that kind of triggers that strange feeling inside us? And it's really interesting because it's actually been written about by a Japanese professor as early as 1970, and it's Professor Masahiro Mori, and it's called the Uncanny Valley. And I think it's something that we should all know about because we all know this feeling, but we probably haven't heard it put into words. And the Uncanny Valley is essentially when any kind of machine, or maybe a computer program, or maybe a graphic in a film, for example, when it's not realistic, when it looks obviously artificial, we're not bothered. We kind of might chuckle at it and say, that's stupid. I'm not convinced by that. Like terrible graphics in 80s films. It just doesn't really do it for us. But then it gradually gets more realistic. Like the case of the robotic arms here, they move so lifelike. Like there's an interior dialogue, they're thinking. And the more something becomes attuned to what we consider realistic human behavior, the more uncomfortable we become with it. So think about when you're watching, again, I'll go with the CGI in the movies, you're watching a film and you can't work out what's wrong with someone's face. It doesn't look real, but it doesn't look artificial either. And it distracts you. It takes you out of the moment. And you find yourself going, what's going on with that person's face? And then in the next scene, their face sprouts horns or something, and you realise it was CGI all along. But it's that moment when we can't quite tell if it's real or not real that's called the uncanny valley. And in robotic and computer theory terms, it's a moment where human beings are repelled by something. They automatically dislike it. And McQueen is playing with that idea. So is Rebecca Horn. Something that is inorganic behaving in an organic, human-like way is so disturbing to us.
Well, that's it. And it's kind of like, for me, it reminds me of when you watch something like, to completely lower the tone, when you watch something like This Morning and people, and they bring on sort of robots or these sort of weird sex dolls, and it makes you, they're so realistic, it just doesn't sit with you. It's so interesting to unpick that idea. I love that, the uncanny valley. It's
I'd like to visit, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it'd be terrifying. I think everyone would leave with a little bit of post-traumatic stress disorder, but like, oh, that was a weird one. But
this is what I mean about the layers. So if you think
Yeah.
about this particular piece, we've got his inspiration from Rebecca Horn. We've got the uncanny valley. Whether he intended that or not, he's definitely tapping into it. We have got the arts and crafts movement. I mean, this is so many layers already. So is this what we always fear? Is this the practice of intellectuals and art historians applying all of these ideas afterwards, or is this genuinely what McQueen was embedding in his work himself? And I think I've got a quote here somewhere in one of my notes that should hopefully, I don't want to do a cocktail party, I'd rather people left my shows and vomited. So he was definitely trying to trigger people, but whether he was really, really engaging with intellectual ideas, that may never be answered.
Well, that's it. And I think again, it just comes back to really, in my opinion, cement the idea that, the job of the artist is really to shock and beat their own drum and wander off the track. If you think of some of the best, most controversial pieces of art and even architecture, they've really sort of danced to the beat of their own drum. And that's exactly what McQueen is doing here. And for me, this is a great example of just the story behind what you see before you, and why it's always so much more interesting to sort of look beyond, as I call it, look beyond the canvas, look beyond what is presented. There's a whole realm of possibilities, and and this is just one interpretation of it. There could be someone that watches this and says, "Oh my God, well, it's clearly this, and this is what's inspired that people." There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just everyone trying to, again, kind of like the Sublime, just trying to kind of figure out, I don't know, like what's being comfortable, but yet so uncomfortable at the same time, like wondering and trying to sort of unpick and unpack
Well,
It
I
could be.
think the slight difficulty with unpicking and unpacking it, it's a little bit like the magician telling
Mm,
you how he did the trick.
yeah.
I think if someone hadn't seen this particular finale, number 13 finale with Shalom Harlow, and would hear this podcast first, they might not feel as awed or surprised as someone who hadn't. I think you kind of need to come to it unencumbered, and and then find out, unpick it afterwards, because you want that initial rush of, what am I seeing?
Yeah.
What is this? It's the same. I mean, one of the closest experiences I've ever had to that day when I saw the YouTube video. I mean, I feel ridiculous saying I had an emotional church-like experience watching YouTube, but I did. But I had an emotional church-like experience when I went and saw the Rothko paintings in Tate Modern, in that subdued room. Do you
Mm.
know the ones
Oh
I'm talking
my gosh,
about?
yes. Hmm.
That is for me the same experience, and we all encounter art in different ways, but I had a very visceral emotional reaction to these very oppressive, very dark, strangely intangible paintings. They're hanging on the wall, but they feel like they could be 10 feet on the other side of the wall, but they also feel like they could be right up against your face. Something about them, you can't quite ascertain where they are in your realm. Does that sound really esoteric?
No, but I think it's such an interesting way to sort of look at Rothko, for example, because he's somebody who, I don't know, he kind of leaves me a bit cold. But again, art is so art is so subjective. Like, and I think that's amazing that you've had that experience. Whereas I've had it with other paintings where I've just been so bowled over, and you can't quite put your finger on what
Mm-hmm.
it is about them. That
Well, I'll be honest with you. It's only those paintings by Rothko that move me.
oh, I
When
love
I see
that.
the yellows and the greens, it's even more than just personal to me. It's personal to me in that situation with those paintings. But I'd be interested, what painting moved you in a similar way, or what artwork?
So I've had a few of these sort of epiphany moments, as I call them, and I've had one with right. So it's not the best sculpture I've ever seen in my life, but it's a sculpture by an artist called Philip Jackson, and he's actually better known for having the War Memorial at Hyde Park, and it's the sort of bomber pilots that are kind of sort of in uniform, and it's a group of five. So he's known for these, but he does these really very weird, this is going to sound odd, nun sculptures. And they kind of look like something out of Doctor Who. And there's this otherworldly quality to them. And I don't know if it's because I was brought up as a practicing Catholic. They make me really uneasy, but I'm so curious by
I'm
them.
going to make a terrible parallel
Oh,
here,
go.
but in the film Death Becomes Her, there's a scene down in the mortuary where three nuns just glide down the corridor, and in the entire film, it's probably one of the more iconic and spooky moments. And Philip Jackson's three nun sculptures together remind me of that particular moment. So there's
Oh.
definitely an uneasiness to them. If my brain is going straight to my other uneasy memory
Mm.
from one of my favorite films, then I can totally understand that sense of, ooh, that's giving me a chill, because that's sometimes what you want from art. You want it to elicit an emotional response.
Well, that's it. And much like the Rothkos at Tate, these nuns, they're above life size. They're about 2 meters or something, and they demand attention, and they are the authority in their space. And you just have to kind of bow down to them almost. They are just, for me anyway, so powerful. And I don't know, and it's the first time really I had an experience like that, and it's actually what kind of like set me on my so I work in a sculpture gallery, so that actually kind of set me on my trajectory of, oh, sculpture, this is my jam. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just that experience for me was so powerful, and it stays with me. And it's something that's not really happened too much, maybe one other time, but when I saw Beaver's painting, by Seurat at the National Gallery. But I think I had that because it was the first painting I ever wrote about when I was like 14 at school.
Yeah.
And it was
I do
more,
think as well, like the more involved you become with these artworks, it kind of intensifies, because I do feel like with number 13, I watched it again yesterday
mhm.
to, I must remind myself. And it hadn't lost any of its power. I think it had actually intensified. So maybe what I said earlier about someone who's listened to this podcast, then going on to watch number 13 and maybe not having such a visceral emotional response, maybe that's wrong. Maybe knowing all of this can actually intensify your understanding and appreciation.
Well, maybe because I actually, a lot of my friends, when they come to visit me at work and I walk them around the gallery and I talk to them, they say, oh, that makes me appreciate the work so much more now that I have a little bit of backstory to it. But this is what I was going to ask you. Would you say it's better for people to watch the fashion show before they listen to this? Or would you say it doesn't really matter? Because I could always put that in at the end,
I
at the
don't
start,
know.
sorry.
I don't know. I really don't know. I think some people will come with some knowledge already, and I couldn't say.
But even the image of, of Harlow in the dress, it's so iconic within
Hmm.
the realms of fashion anyway, that, and even in art and McQueen. So, because when you sent me the images to begin with, I was like, oh, I've seen this before. I didn't know exactly, the whole backstory behind it, but I knew of the image. So I wonder, because you kind of just soak it up in your everyday life when you pick up a magazine or things like that. And yeah, so I wonder how many people have just accidentally come across it, not really realizing, like I had.
Well, I showed the video to a group of people. They were all interested in art. We had someone who was fascinated by Donald Judd and someone else who was fascinated by Andy Warhol. And I kind of showed this video to this group of people and didn't really expect any of them who I saw as kind of art purists to have much of a reaction to it. This was at the very beginning of my love for McQueen, if you like. So I found it hard to imagine other people could be excited by it. But this room full of people were turned on, switched on, activated, asking questions, talking about it, really animated. And it was probably because it came so left field. You know, my Donald Judd colleague was fascinated in these simple, minimalistic sculptures. And this was so different to that, yet totally interested. And yeah, they because I think it's quite left field and it's not conventional art, I think it makes it more accessible in a lot of ways. I mean, people have heard of Alexander McQueen, they know a bit about his life story, so they're already slightly invested.
Yeah, totally. And I love that idea of what you said there about your colleagues getting very animated, because that is exactly what happened to me when I watched The Windows of Culloden. And I think I'm going to have to get you back on to talk about the Melancholy and this show. But I had to physically get up and walk around the room after I watched it, because I was like, oh my God, what have I just seen? That's insane. And I had to really work off the energy that it had, like, all of a sudden it had surged within me, because it was 7 o'clock in the morning and no one was up, so I couldn't talk to my flatmates. So I was like, and then when I got into work that day, I was like, oh my God, guys, I watched this morning. It's blowing my mind. And I had to talk about it with people, and have people watch it and then be like, oh my God, that's insane. Like, so it's just this incredible, this power that isn't lost.
Well, that is, I think the power surges out of the art into us, and then it can go effectively viral from there. We can infect other people with it. This is unfortunate language to be using during a pandemic, but
Yep.
I think that is the power of great art, and it all starts with infusing something in the original artwork that does activate, that does transcend and translate to different people in different fields. I mean, I'm going to have to talk negatively. I think there are other artworks out there that just don't do anything for you at all. You don't go away and say, "Oh, you must go and see." And so we appreciate there has to be a spectrum. For me, not for everyone. Something like number 13 is right at the top of that spectrum, and I'm sure for you, whatever's at the bottom of that spectrum, it's probably not at the bottom of mine. We this is the interesting thing about art. It is subjective.
No, completely. And I would really love people listening at home to get in touch and let us know if you'd seen this presentation before, if you'd seen number 13, and just your feelings, and how it made you feel. Because like you said, you and I wax lyrical about it all day, and someone could watch it and be like, nah, doesn't do anything for me. And that's perfectly fine. That's okay. And that's what's so fabulous about art. And I think that's what people have to remember as well. Just because everyone else in a room thinks it's the best thing they've ever seen and you don't get it, doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything or says anything about you. It's
But
just,
it's still interesting because then you
yeah.
can have that discussion. So why didn't you like it? Oh, okay. So what do you like? And for me, I mean, this is why we're doing this. We're having this conversation. Talking about art brings up so many ideas. When you disagree, when you agree, it doesn't matter. It just gets you thinking. It exposes you to new ideas. Like, I didn't know too much about Philip Jackson before, and now I'm kind of turned on to these nuns, these spooky nuns. That's new for me. And also the idea that maybe, for me, I've never really considered the sublime in sculpture. I kind of jumped that. I considered the sublime in famous paintings and then transposed that idea to the idea of a performance sphere, like the catwalk. But the idea of the sublime existing in a sculpture is interesting, and I would be very interested to kind of mentally unpack that further. I mean, one thing to say about the sublime is that essentially when you encounter the sublime, you need some kind of framing or some kind of anchor that holds you in the realm of reality and reassures you that you are safe.
Mm-hmm.
And for us watching number 13, we could say, oh, it's the computer. The computer is mediating my experience and it's preventing me from feeling the fear of these machines lashing out on this human. But at the same time, because of the way Shalom Harlow is moving, we kind of read through her, we empathize with her. So we get the intensity of her experience, but we get it mediated through our computer screens. I would love to have been able to go to the Gatliff warehouse and sit in those bleacher seats and watch this for real, because I would have been very interested to know. I mean, obviously I would want to go and see that, but I would be interested to experience the sublime in the physical sphere and see, you know, what becomes my anchor of safety. Is it the chair I'm sat in? Is it the audience around me? Something will change completely, and you want to pull apart these intellectual ideas and kind of interrogate them and go, okay, so what made me feel safe? What made me feel nervous? And that means that art is allowing us to interrogate our interior feelings, our world. Like, that's interesting.
That is, oh my goodness, you have just put it nail on the head so beautifully there, Robert. And also, like, at the end of that presentation, they must have been able to cut the atmosphere with a knife.
They were going berserk. They were applauding insanely.
Oh,
Yeah. And I think if you, on the video, if you look very carefully, you can see Isabella Blow, his long-term best friend, the person who actually bought his entire first collection, who sadly died in 2007, shortly before McQueen killed himself in 2010. But she is going insane. She's like his number one fan. And that, again, for me, adds another layer. You know, it's this human element that this designer has come up with this finale. The world is now seeing it for the first time, and everyone's so happy that it's had its impact. There's a real, it's the applause at the end of a play that you went to see where your best friend's on stage and you're so happy for them.
yeah. Oh, it's just amazing. Robert, I could talk to you about this literally all day, but to save the podcast being, 14 hours long.
Sounds like you've got a lot of editing to do.
Oh my goodness. No, not at all. I actually think I'm going to keep this in. I just think it's such an interesting chat to and it would be so interesting to see also what other people think and how they feel if they haven't seen this before after they watch it. I would love to know. So Robert, I just have to thank you so, so much. You have been amazing. And like I said, I will link your essay below in the show notes, and I would thoroughly encourage everybody to go and read it. Make yourself a nice cup of tea or a coffee and just give yourself some time to work your way through it. It is so interesting. And of course, this is the Joe's Art History podcast, so I do have one final question for you.
Uh-oh.
But my question is, why is art important?
Wow. Okay, well, we've talked a little bit about how art is subjective, so I think I have to talk about why art is important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And As an art historian, I have a specific perspective on this. To me, it's important because it captures a different, sometimes contradictory snapshot of a moment in time. Like the history books, they record one thing, but art can tell us something else. Art can convey the feeling, and I think that's what we've been talking about quite a bit: the feeling, the mood, the anxieties of a period in time, more so than any text or historical timeline can. So I would say art is important to me because it completes the picture, and it shows us the human in history.
Oh my goodness. I love that. Shows us the human. Well done. Beautifully answered, I must say, because it's quite a difficult question to just kind of get thrown at you. Robert, where can people find you and what you're up to?
Well, I'm like you, an art historian. I'm a freelance writer and I specialize in fashion, which you may have guessed by now. So everything from medieval embroidery to Victorian crinolines and 90s catwalks. I love the 90s. I should hopefully be able to share some specialist insights. As you've mentioned, I've got my article at the moment on the Fashion Studies Journal, but you can also follow me on Instagram at Robert J.W. McCaffrey.
Lovely. And you have a website as well, which I'll link below in the show notes. Robert, you have been amazing. And once again, thank you for opening my eyes to this amazing realm of Alexander McQueen and where art and fashion fuse
You're
together.
welcome. And thank you for doing this podcast. I think it's so nice to hear people talk about their passions.
Thank you. And do you know what? I'm really, really loving it because I just think people are so interesting and everyone has their own thing that they want to sort of beat their own drum about. And I think that needs to be celebrated. And art shouldn't be this thing where it's for the few. Art is for everybody. And I'm just loving, I'm learning so much doing this. And I hope people listening are as well. But Robert, thank you so much. And I would love to have you back on to talk about the Melancholy if you've enjoyed yourself here today.
I absolutely did and absolutely will.
Amazing. Robert, thank you so much. You have been fab.
Bye-bye.
Right, thank you so much. Bye. And there you have it, the end of another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. I would just like to take a moment here to thank Robert once again for coming on and speaking so enthusiastically and passionately about Alexander McQueen, The Sublime, and of course his collection number 13. I would really thoroughly encourage you to look in the show notes below and not only watch the presentation but also read Robert's paper on the Fashion Studies Journal. It's so interesting, and as Robert said at the end, he will come back on and talk about the Melancholy and the fabulous collection of windows at Culloden, which we touched on very briefly at the end of the podcast, but I'll leave a link to that as well. Because it's really not one to be missed, and like I said, I found myself having to sort of like walk very briskly around my living room just to try and sort of work off the energy. It's really incredible. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. I've learned lots in researching for this, and also from Robert, who speaks so fabulously, and it was a joy not only to record but even editing. I really didn't have to do anything. He's just so concise and beautifully spoken, and I'm sure you will agree with me. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please make sure that you like, rate and subscribe. And while you've been listening, if you think you might know someone that would be interested in hearing Robert talk about Alexander McQueen, then please do feel free to pass it on. It would be lovely to get more people listening to the podcast. If you would like to get in touch, you're very welcome to. You can email joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at joesarthistory, where I post daily art historical content, and also there's links to the previous podcasts as well. Finally, my name is Jo McLaughlin. I have been your host and your resident art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all.